Chaudhury. Please begin her talk.
Thank you very much, Rajashree, and thank you very much to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak today. A special thank you to Professor T.B. Singh, who called me and made this possible. As have been already introduced, that what I'm really looking at is how do we understand the pandemic from a social science perspective? What is our role, understanding the pandemic as social scientists? Because increasingly globally within our own country, there's a sense of irrelevance for social scientists, that what is our role? Particularly in moments of unprecedented crisis, the kind of crisis that we are facing today, there is a sense that what can we do in such a pandemic? Because there is a certain urgency about the issue. You feel a little foolish sometimes giving a lecture, writing a paper, reading a book, that what relevance could this be when people are dying, when people are falling ill, when the economy is in crisis, people are getting unemployed, when there are livelihood issues, issues of life. So it is from that perspective that I'm looking at the pandemic. As I just mentioned, we are not what are called today frontline workers. We are not sanitation workers. We are not health workers. We are not providers of essential services. Are we then irrelevant? Or do we need to understand the question of relevance a little differently? Perhaps we need to step back a bit and go back to what we all know, but which we often do not fully grasp, the historical relationship between crisis and the social sciences. That there is a certain intrinsic and inextricable relationship between crisis and the social sciences. If we go back, I don't know how many of my fellow colleagues and the audience are from a sociology background, but since that is my vantage point, that's the location from I can speak. Any textbook account about sociology will often mention these three great events, and all of it, in a certain sense, is a crisis. The Enlightenment in the West, the French Revolution in France, and the beginning of modernity with industrial capitalism. We read it in every textbook, that emergence and growth of sociology, it is in every UGC syllabus, it is in every UPSC syllabus. What does it actually mean? What kind of crisis led to the birth of social sciences? And do we, if we go back into that location, would that give us a certain kind of perspective to look at the current crisis of the pandemic? So if we look at the Enlightenment, that was a transformation of how people thought. The kind of ideas through which people thought, the basic emphasis on, the way we think, make sense of reality. Many of you who would come from a sociology background would have looked at Auguste Comte, known about his classification of theological, metaphysical, positivistic. Basically that in a pre-modern world, we made sense of the world through ideas which came either from our religion or ideas of the supernatural, a sense of what is happening to us, how do we live a good life, what is a good life, what is the meaning of life, where the ideas came supposedly from somewhere else, from a higher power, if you wish to say. The Enlightenment, in a certain sense, turned that around and said that can we make sense of the reality as it exists now, through rationality, through questioning, through science? Why does this pandemic happen? If you go back and say, does this enlightenment today seem so remote? उनके साथ हमारे क्या लेना देना है? That here we are in India, I'm in Delhi, some of you are in Kanpur, some of you. What connection does this enlightenment have with us? And it's important to realize that there is a connection. The connection is the fact that it was the beginning of what we understand the modern world. Maybe not the modern world of a time when we couldn't speak to each other. I didn't even know about anything called the Zoom before the pandemic. I had no idea about what it was. But the fact is that we are all today in this world of science, technology, but unfortunately not often of reason and interrogation. So we have a lot of science, we have a lot of technology, but very often we do not have the wherewithal of a kind of questioning perspective, examining evidence, interrogation, the basic questions of science, checking everything to the tenets of either evidence, reason, and a procedure through which it gets done. In the pandemic, for example, we're having a lot of discussion on the vaccine. All of us are waiting for the vaccine. I am a senior citizen. I'm petrified, and I'm waiting for the pandemic. Maybe then I can go back and go out and live a reasonable life. But it's not a magic. It's not a magic pill. It takes certain procedures, protocols of scientific understanding. May take 12 months, may take 16 months, may take 18 months for it to come up. And even then, it is subject to scrutiny, subject to re-examination and say, shayad it's not working. Maybe there is something else required. It needs time. So just like natural science needs time, social science needs time. And some of the tenets, not all, some of the tenets or some of the principles which inform the natural sciences are similar to the principles of social science. Procedures, methods of interrogation, subject to validation, subject to evidence, certain kind of protocol by which you can be questioned by others, ki aap data kahan se laya? So those are certain kind of procedures which are important. So when we think about the Enlightenment, crisis and social sciences, one kind of lay response is, what do we do with all that? So far away, Europe mein baat hai, how does it impact us? It does impact us. And you will find it very interesting. In India, in the 19th century, most of the people who are social reformers, religious reformers, writers, poets, thinkers, often were influenced by the Enlightenment. So if you look at somebody like Rana Day, he was actually examining Bacon. If you look at any of the thinkers of that time, the Enlightenment is something which became part and parcel of our lives, just like Zoom is now becoming, or any of these online is becoming part of our everyday life. Look at the other crises. I call the Enlightenment a crisis in the sense it changed the existing mode of thinking or inquiry. The French Revolution, which brought about democracy, rights, freedom, all of you are familiar, liberty, equality, fraternity, was a crisis because it transformed the way society was organized before that. It was an aristocratic society, it was a monarchical society, it was a feudal society based on hierarchies. Hierarchies, inequalities existed and they were considered to be all right. Not only that they existed, but it was all right for them to exist. This transformed everything. And it transformed not just France, it transformed distant countries like most of the colonized countries, including India, who then wanted to fight colonialism, who said Swaraj is our birthright, like Tilak did, that if you are free, why are we not free? Going back to the beginnings of our national movement. So it defined democracy, our own constitution, the existing functioning of our country rests on ideas which have traveled, acquired new meanings, become different in some ways, but there has been a kind of global movement, whether it's the Enlightenment or the French Revolution. The third, industrial capitalism, the way society is organized, the whole modern technology and the nature of capitalism, ever expanding, searching for new markets, innovation, entrepreneurship, that if you can't get profit, you close down. All of us know if I want to open a shop after retirement, and if I don't make profit, my shop has to close. That is the logic of the organization, the logic of the system. And it kept expanding. It kept expanding. Right now, we're talking about the pandemic. 5 years ago, if we had a conference, we would have talked about globalization. We would have talked about shrinking of space and time. We would have talked about mobility. We would have talked about all the issues of an interconnected globe. But suddenly you have the pandemic which comes and makes us look at some of these organizations a little differently. Then why did this virus happen? And in the initial days of the lockdown, everybody started saying, look, the sky is looking more blue, and the air is better to breathe with. And people started looking at the question of how we engage with the environment. What is our relationship with environment, the question of ecology, the question of sustainable development, the question and dangers of unfettered acquisition of profit. So each of these, if you look back and say, okay, these three topics are not just topics for our examinations or that we must do, but something which enables us or gives us a certain tool for understanding the pandemic as it has happened today. It's very interesting that, say, even I, and most of us who are social scientists, maybe some of you felt differently. Initially, when the disease struck us, it seemed a disease in the sense, the question, okay, let's wash our hands. Does it, spread from surfaces? Is it direct face to face? It seemed to be a medical question. But as I would like to quote from a very well-known epidemiologist and medical historian, there is a very close relationship between a disease and a pandemic and social structure. I quote, epidemic diseases are not random events that afflict societies capriciously and without warning. On the contrary, every society produces its own specific vulnerabilities. To study them is to understand the society's structure, its standard of living, its political priorities. So if you study the impact of pandemic, you are actually studying the social structure of a society. If you study the pandemic, you're actually studying the International Division of Labor, the International Organization of Society. Say, for example, if you make a comparative study of other epidemics, say in our own country, tuberculosis, TB, and it's very interesting that if you read old novels or if you read old poetry, I mean, including if any of you read English poetry, Keats, for example, many of them died of. So it was in the early years, TB was supposed to be the disease of the rich, of the well-to-do. And then they would have to go to a sanatorium, they would have to be spent, and they would become all right, or they would suffer. But over a period of time, what began with the rich, it spread to the poor. Now, if you look at the COVID-19, the initial days, early March, we said, okay, there are some Italian tourists and they've been, identified with COVID-19. That is, it's something which has come from the West, it's come a foreign disease. And then we find that, okay, it's not just Italian tourists, but we also have Indians who are coming back from foreign countries. So it came with airports, aeroplanes, people who could afford that kind of international flight. But as the pandemic spread, we said, oh my God, it has now hit Dharavi, it has hit the biggest slum. And what's going to happen now? It is going to move and spread among people who cannot probably do the physical distancing that is required, who may not have soap and water to constantly wash or a sanitizer, who may not be able to use the mask or may use the mask in the ways that our, I used to be often struck by the way in our country you had bottle feed for babies. And a bottle feed, if any of you are familiar with raising babies, if you have to use the bottled milk, you have to boil the bottles. You have to make sure they're sanitized, or you have to use disposable. All of it needs money and labor. So what happened over a period of time in our country, I noticed that a lot of people who have the privilege may switch back to mother's milk. And the people who do not, like I've seen a bottled milk, maybe the dhobi is, feeding their baby with that. The flies are squatting on it, not following any of these procedures, okay? So you have a strange manner in which the social structure of a society react to social change, technological innovations, and pandemics. And it is to understand this that my focus is, that's why I called it Understanding the Pandemic, Understanding the Social Structure. I go back also to the point, what is our relevance? We are not frontline workers, but yes, we can throw light. We can perhaps contribute in a certain sense to what the post-pandemic world would look like. We can perhaps be able to even feed back into policy matters if we understand the structure of a society and the specific vulnerabilities of different sections of people. I think, Dr. Sonal was already mentioned the change social, this new normal. And all of us are talking about the new normal. And many of us who belong to a middle-class world in India we know what we mean when we say new normal. So if I ring up any of my older students who are working, they are just overwhelmed because they have to obviously cook. You don't have the housework, which is usually normally outsourced in our country, domestic workers. They are saying their children are completely overwhelmed with online work, which the schools are giving. So one of them told me that her child, who's just 6 years old, gets so irritated with the online lecture that she thinks the only way of getting out of it is closing the laptop. Okay, so these are new normals. And we know when we say that what we mean by, look at the new normal, how we shop, how we eat, how we exercise, how we manage our health, how we socialize, how we spend our free time. Everything is new. It's a new normal. The problem here from a social scientist perspective is, who are the we? And what is the new normal to us may not be the new normal to somebody else. So many of us said, okay, let's now binge on Netflix. Let's sort of go to Amazon Prime. Let's dig out certain things. Maybe let's try and do some old recipes. I can do it, because I am within a certain comfort zone within which I can do. Many can't. The crisis of the migrants in our country is an obvious case that the we talk of as the new normal is not their new normal. It's a very, very different kind. And the basis of a social science is that we have to go outside what we call our own ethnocentric vision. That is, the world as I experience it, the world which is my lived reality, my common sense world, is not everybody's world. That is the logic of social science, that you have to go beyond that and do a certain comparative perspective. Now, as I've already mentioned, we all know it's a crisis of an unprecedented nature. If we restrict ourselves to our experiential reality, our common sense reality, I can giving the examples, and all of us will relate with it. My own middle class kind of examples that I can give. But if we move beyond this micro experiential level, we will find that the COVID-19 is much larger. It has affected every aspect of life around the globe. Individual relationships, yes, but institutional operations to international. Society, having to say that we have to, for example, we had to take the measure that you cannot have international air travel. We have to stop trains. What happens? The economies are crushed. And this is now, again, if we go back to the past, and many of you would have done our history textbooks and says, the British came and they wanted to invest in railways. And the first train connection between Thane and Bombay, because they wanted to connect their the ports, the shipping towns, the places where they could get raw materials. There's a place like Jamshedpur, Chotanagpur, where they would get the coal. It had to be carried to Bombay, where there would be other industries. These were, so to say, the instruments of a modern economy. A modern economy was established through these particular features. Interestingly, if you go back to somebody like, Gandhiji's Hind Swaraj, he has a very different take on the railways, and it will be very interesting if you can have a look at it, So it's important to see the pandemic as a vantage point. It's something like it opens, it removes the curtain from life, and the social structure which we didn't always notice in our everyday life, as we had to rush to work, go to class, catch the metro, do this kind of work. We didn't notice the entire dynamics of the social structure, but the pandemic has exposed it in a dramatic fashion. Now, I want to examine the buzzword, the new normal, and the category of what we can see when we use the word new normal and what we cannot see or what escapes us. Here, words are very important. All of us know that. Words have magic, and words capture the reality. Words capture reality. So everybody now knows the word new normal. 3 months back or 4 months back, I didn't use the word. I didn't know this word. So they capture world. The word, any term captures the world. We can see the world through that word. But the problem is that we also can't see some parts of the world through that word. Words are like light, like a torch. You open a torch, you switch on the torch, it throws light on a particular place. But some other parts are in darkness, you can't see it. A word is like a torchlight. A concept and a word is like a torchlight. So when you say new normal, and we say, oh yes, I have to work from home, I haven't cooked for so long, I'm cooking now, I've forgotten how to do jharu pocha, I'm back to doing jharu pocha, maybe people who are not in India do not have those kind of issues, but in India, where we are used to outsourcing work in a very unequal society, these are issues. We're talking from work from home, study from home. Now here, let's examine each of this, and see how it will be different to different people located in different parts of the social structure. So housework for me, I am frankly exhausted. So when, Professor Singh said, mind speaking in the evening, I said, I'm fine. That means my housework gets over. I'm old. I get very, very tired. And maybe by 5 o'clock, I'll have enough energy to give a certain lecture. But for my domestic worker, she was calling me up and she needed money. Husband had lost her job. So yesterday, in fact, I had to go to the gate of my university and give her money, because for them it's job loss. It is actually reduced to, it's a question of livelihood. It's a question of hunger. It's a question of looking after their families. Completely different. Work from home for men and women mean very different kinds of things. And a lot of literature has already come about, the debate on housework, which was so important in West European or North American societies in the late 60s and 70s, didn't really reach India. It didn't really matter, because we could outsource, our work. If you're a working woman, you could outsource your work, and the stress of division of sharing work within the home was not a very big issue here. But you've noticed, I've been noticing in newspapers, magazines, social media, television, a great focus on housework. And sometimes the advertisements which are catering to the new normal is a bit like the old normal. And here I want to use the word new normal vis-a-vis old normal. And many of you must have seen the advertisements, which was about atta maker, you don't have to guno the atta yourself, you now have a machine. And you say, would you like your maid to guno the atta, and the visual atta getting a little dirty, And he said, now you will have contactless, atta making. And it was obvious there was a lot of criticism of this advertisement, and it was withdrawn because it showed great class and caste discriminatory things. So when we say housework, even this word housework, like the torch, shows certain things, makes certain things invisible. And for social scientists, it's important to dig up, and see things beyond the surface, beyond the evidence. Likewise, work from home. For me, it is very, very exhausting. Maybe for some men of my generation, it's not so exhausting. Maybe younger men are far more democratic with their sharing of workload. studying from home is very, very different. We are having a lot of anxiety among our students in the university because many of them have gone home. They have intermittent internet access. Some are in small homes where maybe a laptop is shared. Maybe they do not have the privacy of a place to study. And so you have the inequities of what we call the digital inequalities. So can we have online education? Can we have study from home, which is equal and just? Some of us can. Like I can lock my room and give this lecture. But supposing I had many more people who are sharing this room, how would I do it? How would it work? Now, I come to a slightly more theoretical question. So what is the relationship between experience and knowledge? I've already mentioned it earlier that we can't just talk about my experience and generalize from my experience, but social science has to locate us within the social structure. Who am I? Am I a woman? Which class? Which background? What are my privilege? What are my social capital, my cultural capital? And that is going to explain how experiences are different, and knowledge has to take account of multiple experiences which are taking place in this world. So how the pandemic is affecting my, my domestic worker, and how the pandemic is affecting me. How it is affecting the migrant, how is it affecting somebody else. So the old normal and what it crisis, we've talked about the new normal, but along the new normal, there is an old normal. So the advertisement which said, would you like, dirty hands to contaminate the atta, is referring to old prejudices, old stereotypes, that is the old normal, that is the social structure, class, caste, gender, tribe, maybe age. Age is a huge issue in the pandemic, old age, vulnerabilities again. And we need to look at not just the new normal, which the media is talking about, but we also need to look at the old normal. Both are true. Importantly, I'm not saying one is false and one is true. It is only that each is a partially true and partially conceals. I finally come to the question that everybody's saying, that the virus is non-discriminatory. And indeed it is. The richest person can get it, the poorest person can get it, the richest person can die, and so could the poorest. So the question that has come up, that are we really all in the same boat? Are we really all in the same side? In a certain sense, we are. We are all very vulnerable. But the degree of vulnerability, if you look at statistics, vary. And many people have formulated it like this, that we are all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. Or that is our ability to isolate ourselves. Physical distancing, work from home, homeschool your children, pack my refrigerator, make sure I can call from the grocer, my one month's saman ek saath bula lo, so that you don't have to keep facing the hazard of going to the shop. All of it will depend upon whether I can afford it, or whether I can call for it. Depends on class, gender, race, age, and geography dependent. It is localized. It is the social structure. Now, how does the pandemic help us to see and reflect on what is happening? It asks questions about ourselves. It asks questions about social relationship and life generally. We have seen incredible sacrifice by people. Doctors have died, health workers have died, sanitation workers have died. Great sacrifices, great solidarity. We have also seen in this moment great nastiness, suggestions that this epidemic, this virus may have a race. This virus may be carried by only some particular community or a particular caste or a particular class. We have seen both the best in human life, the greatest solidarity, and we've also seen the most sad and the tragic part of human life. Now, for us as social scientists, we have